as well.
And many other types of land use change have been associated with these infections. Basically, what I called emerging viruses or emerging infections. A number of years ago, like most microbiologists and virologists, I thought it had something to do with the way these viruses rapidly evolve, the sort of Andromeda-like quality. But the reality is most of them are already there somewhere else in nature, in another species, and we just haven't really stumbled on them. So if deforestation, other environmental changes could easily allow these infections to gain access to humans, and then it's a matter of whether they can establish themselves and spread further. That was the big surprise with Ebola, which is spread person to person and doesn't spread that readily, but we never expected, and we should have not been complacent about the possibility of a really big outbreak if it got into an urban area.
Have we failed at containing Ebola?
Well, I think Ebola is in the environment, probably originally from bats, although that's not entirely certain. Some of its relatives, the most closely related virus is, and it's probably fairly widely distributed because it keeps popping up, or various varieties of Ebola keep popping up in places like Uganda, where before 2001 no one knew it was there. So I think it's probably there in the environment, and what happens is suddenly somebody stumbles upon it in the forest or wherever.
Can some of the contributing reasons for a pandemic be surprising? I've read that the global used tire trade may be a factor because researchers have observed mosquitoes breeding in pools of water that form in the hollows of the tires while they're sitting outside, and then the tires are shipped to another country, and they bring along the mosquitoes that are carrying the diseases to foreign populations that may not even have developed an immunity to them.
That's absolutely true, and in fact, for a long time, the mosquito we were worried about with yellow fever, dengue, now Zika, and chikungunya and all these other things in tropical areas was Aedes aegypti, which was actually brought over to the New World through the African slave trade, along with yellow fever. But more recently, in the 1980s, a related mosquito called Aedes albopictus, the Asian tiger mosquito, actually was brought into Houston and a number of cities all over the world, actually, Lagos, Rio, through, in fact, used tires. And the eggs were there, and when they got wet, the mosquitoes bred. And this species, Aedes albopictus, is now well established in a number of places, including many parts of the United States as far north as Chicago. So there's some concern about, what that might be able to do, although it's not as efficient as Aegypti at carrying disease.
Mosquitoes thrive in warmer and humid climates, and prolonged warm seasons increase their breeding season, but can temperatures sometimes get too high and kill them off?
Oh yes, and
so global warming, if it really is effective, is going to kill mosquitoes in Houston in the near future?
Assuming that we can still afford to air condition, so it doesn't kill us first. Yeah, actually, for the many of the tropical mosquitoes, especially, the warmer it is, the shorter their lifespan. So, but they, even though they may only live a few days to a week, they are very active during that period.
And it's only the female mosquito that bites us.
Absolutely. The males are, as usual, just sort of, well, in this case, they're in the background, but the female mosquito needs something from our hemoglobin in order for the eggs to mature. That's why they bite mammals.
So we're nourishing the future mosquitoes.
Oh, yes. And that's exactly right. So every time a mosquito bites us, the unfortunate feeling is that, there you are contributing to their next generation, which means more mosquitoes next year.
And sometimes, as a favor, they give us something like a Zika virus.
Yeah.
There was a lot of concern about SARS. How dangerous did that disease turn out to be?
Well, and I think it's an indication of our, general vulnerability to infections that we may not be aware of, or may be aware of, but aren't really able to know what's going to happen. SARS spread through many countries throughout the world, and it's one of the few events where we actually can find kind of a big bang distribution. We usually can't find the proverbial smoking gun or smoking mosquito or whatever that started the infection, but with SARS, it started in South China. Someone a doctor in fact, who had treated patients, came from there to Hong Kong, stayed in a hotel, and somehow about a dozen other people at the same hotel became sick and spread it to a number of other places, including very famously Toronto, mostly through the healthcare system, mostly because healthcare workers were not aware of the precautions, as we saw here with Ebola, that they needed to take.
So mosquitoes could be transmitters of a pandemic, but also just humans moving from place to place. Is that why we saw an explosion of pandemics around the time that air travel became more common?
Yes, Luc Montagnier, discoverer of the HIV, in fact used to call the 747, the wide-body jet, the vector of HIV, the way the mosquito is the vector, that's the term we use, of yellow fever or Zika. Indeed, there are a number of infections that are transmitted person to person, including one that was pandemic and, still is, tuberculosis, but influenza, for example, really is spread from person to person essentially in an unbroken chain, because it's adapted to humans by the time it gets into us. And so travel has a lot to do with it. And of course, so we've talked about the movement of goods like used tires and other things, and globalization that can in fact globalize these diseases or their carriers as well, either usually inadvertently, of course.
In the case of tuberculosis, it looked like it was pretty much eliminated some years back, but it's come back, so the virus has mutated. But is that what happens with influenza, that we can never beat it back because it's going to be different all the time?
Yeah, influenza is one of the most complex. One of my former professors, Howard Temin, who actually won the Nobel Prize for his work on reverse transcriptase, the enzyme that is kind of essential to the lifestyle of retroviruses. That's why they're called retroviruses. They change their form of nucleic acid genome. But he used to say it was cheating to call influenza an emerging virus, but in fact it's the one that probably fits all of our kind of expectations. It does do a lot of genetic changes, including swapping different parts of its genome between different influenza viruses, as well as mutating. And every so often a successful combination comes up that can now, usually originally from waterfowl, and then usually the mixing seems to occur in pigs, and then suddenly one may reach the human population when a farmer comes by, and that one just might happen to hit the jackpot and be able to spread around the world.
So despite flu shots, people still get sick?
Yes, and we're obviously trying to think of things like universal immunizations, things that would immunize against all the different types of influenza, and that's possible in the future, but I think it still pays to be aware of these things and take precautions.
My guest is Dr. Stephen S. Morse, professor of epidemiology at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia. We are talking about pandemics, and we will continue our conversation after this break. Enhancing vinegars and sauces with infusions is a key part of serious cooking, and it's extremely simple to do. All it takes a few inexpensive ingredients, a mason jar, and just a little time. This Friday, Melissa Clark joins us for the second chapter of Food Fridays Infusions Challenge. Check out some of our recipes and send in your own variations and pictures with the hashtag Food Fridays. Melissa Clark will be on the lookout for her favorites. To learn more, go to wnyc.org/infusions. You're listening to WNYC and WNYC.org.
WNYC receives support from Pax, a novel for middle schoolers by Sarah Pennypacker, with illustrations by John Klassen, the story of a boy, his pet fox, and the war that separates them. More information at findpax.com. Tao's Drumheart, combining traditional Japanese drumming with contemporary dance. February 11th through the 14th at the NYU Skirball Center for the Performing Arts. Tickets at nyuskirball.org or 888-611-8183. WNYC is a media partner of Primary Stages, presenting The Body of an American, a play exploring writer Dan O'Brien's friendship with war photojournalist Paul Watson. February 10th through March 20th at Cherry Lane Theater. Details at primarystages.org.
I'm clear-headed about what I'm doing.
Dr. Willie Parker spent years wrestling with his conscience, but he doesn't do that anymore.
I'm clear that abortion disrupts a life process. We're ending a pregnancy.
I'm Mary Harris. This week on Only Human, I talked to a doctor who provides abortions in the South. The clinic where he works in Mississippi is the last one left in the state, and it's fighting to stay open. Listen at onlyhuman.org or on the WNYC app.
Today on Fresh Air, Terry Gross talks with food writer Bee Wilson about why we love the foods we love and are repulsed by certain foods that we hate. Wilson's new book is called First Bite, How to Learn to Eat. That's today at 2 on 93.9 FM. We are back with Dr. Stephen S. Morse, a professor of epidemiology at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia, formerly the co-director of the USAID PREDICT project. Now, that was hoping to predict pandemics. Never really did the job it was supposed to do?
Well, it's an aspirational term, and it's always good to have aspirations. For, many years, the primary recommendation of every expert group that's ever looked at this problem has always been that we need better surveillance, better early warning and monitoring of what's out there. And in fact, back in the 1990s, some colleagues and myself started something called ProMed, the Program for Monitoring Emerging Diseases. And the email system and website has been called the CNN, if you'll forgive my mentioning that, of infectious diseases. But we still, need good early warning systems. And what USAID wanted to do there was essentially, after the experiences with avian influenza getting into humans, to have a better idea of what's out there so we could at least know sort of what the landscape is. We still, of course, to predict, need to know what things we should be most worried about and have to have some sort of rating system, if you will, to follow them.
Now, we've been talking mostly about pandemics as being viral, but in fact, I guess that's why the word viral has become so popular in other uses. But mentioned tuberculosis, that's caused by a bacillus. Can pandemics be caused by other things, bacteria and mites and whatever else we can imagine?
I tend to deal with the microscopic things, so I'll pass on the mites, but certainly we hear a lot about bed bugs and,
Would you call bed bugs a pandemic?
Well, they're all over the place, so are lice, for example, although hopefully they're rarer here than they used to be, but they also carry their own diseases, and there's a wonderful book about the history of typhus carried by lice called Rat's Lice in History by Zinsser, one of those classics of years back. But yes, bacteria can do it too. We had the famous bubonic plague, the Black Death of the 14th century, and that was certainly one that had tremendous effects. Cholera.
Carried by fleas in that case?
Carried by fleas and coming from rodents, which are the natural hosts, and then the fleas may, for one reason or another, run out of rodents or out of rats or similar rodents and bite us, and we become infected then, and it can spread. But, that's certainly one of the best known of all, and cholera.
And I wonder why rats don't get bubonic plague, why deer don't get Lyme disease. The ticks aren't killed off by it, but it has such a terrible effect on humans.
It's quite possible that this may have happened long ago when these species first became infected, in ancient history, whenever that was. And over time, there's been a sort of evolutionary adaptation, so they may still get sick. It doesn't promise that they won't get sick, but, usually the ones that are most likely to die when they first encounter the disease will succumb, and then the ones that are left are more resistant, and then there's immunity that develops as the infection circulates. We see this with humans too after we've had a lot of experience with an infection and it's been around for a long time, the ones we take for granted as human infections.
Although, as you pointed out earlier, shingles can come after we've had an earlier childhood disease, and one of our listeners has asked on Twitter, Dr. Janet Lee Leslie, what's the incubation period for the shingles virus once you've been exposed to someone with an active case?
Oh, that really varies. So what happens is that someone will get chickenpox in childhood, and there are now vaccines for that, but it used to be considered fairly mild, so people didn't worry about it, And then years later, for one reason or another, we don't understand all the reasons, perhaps waning immunity or something that some other illness, immunosuppression, shingles comes on, the virus gets reactivated from nerve cells. Adults who have not had chickenpox before will get primary chickenpox. The incubation period usually is between 1 to 3 weeks, and that is bad. You don't want to get that if you can avoid it. It's nastier than it is in children.
But there's a shingles vaccine.
There's a vaccine both,
which is very expensive. I wonder why, since it's so common.
Yeah,
Are we going to blame Shkreli for this as well?
No. It took a while to develop, and obviously there are market forces at work. But luckily, it's not, hopefully, quite in that category. But there's also a chickenpox vaccine for children, which is basically the same as the shingles vaccine, but less concentrated.
Now, it's been the Zika has been linked to babies being born with smaller heads and brains that aren't fully developed. Does anyone understand the process? What happens in the womb?
No, we do know, I think, that, both from experimental work and from some work that's been done during this outbreak, that the virus can infect the central nervous system, and it can get into the brain of developing fetuses.
This leads to microcephaly?
And this may cause developmental abnormalities, but we haven't really known for sure. We still don't know for sure whether this microcephaly we're seeing is all caused by Zika. There may be other causes that are not Zika, and there's now an argument that some of these cases may actually not be microcephaly, may actually be normal, but usually you want to cast a wider net to make sure you pick up all the cases so you can study them and rule out things. But there are other causes as well, so whether Zika is doing it by itself, how often Zika is doing it, we don't know. I would guess if it is, it's by getting into the fetus and into the developing brain, but we don't have direct proof, except we know it can do that.
Are there similar diseases?
Yes, there are a number, and not just viral, but, you think about toxoplasmosis, which is another one of those parasites, and is sometimes seen as an opportunistic infection in the old days in AIDS patients. That was actually...
Well, people don't die of AIDS. They die of the fact that their immune system has been weakened so that something else like pneumonia will actually be the cause of death.
Exactly, and many other things that could hasten death as a result of the weakened immune system. We still are only beginning to understand what causes the immune system collapse, because that's a very unusual thing. But toxoplasmosis, which is often, very, very mild infection, in certain stages of pregnancy, when in pregnant women can in fact cause fetal deformities. And we know about rubella, of course, another virus. All of these are unrelated to each other, but they are all capable of causing various abnormalities.
Well, rubella itself is German measles, which was the mildest illness I ever had. But it can lead to autism if a woman is pregnant and gets it?
It can lead to a number of different effects.
I mean, autism in the child.
Yes, and many other developmental problems that have been known for a long time, even before we diagnosed autism routinely. So that's also vaccine preventable. And in New York, for example, it's extremely rare. It doesn't occur here. Naturally, we see imported cases every so often.
A listener asks, is the Zika virus the kind of virus that stays in your body like HPV or chickenpox, or does it go away once you recover?
I think most of these viruses actually do go away. They may persist in certain sequestered places. This is why we hear about the sexual transmission, because the testes is one of the places that the immune system doesn't patrol regularly. We call those immunologically privileged. So is the brain. But in general, I think in the vast majority of cases, when it's over, it's over.